About this now with Peter Mathews. Peter, a political analyst and professor of political science at Cypress College, via Skype with us this hour. Peter, a pleasure to have you.
It's good to be here, George.
Let's start with what the incoming Mexican government is now saying by way of a Washington Post report that it had reached a deal with the Trump administration on migrants staying in that country before entering the United States, keeping in mind this new administration doesn't take control until December 1st. So do you see this denial at face value for what it is, or could this simply be a way of kicking the can until that government officially takes control?
I think it's a way of delaying a bit till the government takes control. And the issue is really critical because until now, the United States had no questions about following our own law, which allows asylum seekers to apply for it when they arrive at the United States border. It doesn't have to be designated port of entry. It could be anywhere on the border. And our government has to accept an application and interview them. And 80% of those who interview pass the initial fear test, the credible fear test. And then eventually only 10% are given the actual right to have asylum. So it's quite a rigorous process that has been working. And now Trump wants to put it on the Mexican government to keep the asylum seekers there rather than allowing them to come in here.
Well, it is also interesting to key into what we're hearing from the incoming Interior Secretary there in Mexico, that Mexico does not have plans to become a, quote, third safe country for migrants, essentially saying that Mexico will not be a waiting room. Clearly, this is a response to pressure on that government from migrants and quite possibly from the United States.
Absolutely, because the Mexican president, the president-elect, Miguel López Obrador, he ran for president 3 times. He won this third time, and it was a very strong platform, and he won by a good margin. And so he has a lot of supporters who want to make sure that Mexico doesn't become a dumping ground, so to speak, for people who will be stuck in Mexico and maybe not be able to get jobs, although some of the businesses there are saying they're going to provide a lot of jobs for these folks, but it remains to be seen. And the Mexican economy is not doing real great right now. I mean, it's been having trouble for the last several decades. And poverty rates have gone from 29% to 49% in Mexico after NAFTA and free trade. But I think that they have their own situation of having to get their economy going once again for their working class and the middle class. They don't want to be overloaded with just a whole lot of migrants coming in, getting blocked at the border. That's the real problem for Mexico as well.
Peter, the U.S. president earlier tweeted that migrants would need to stay in Mexico until their asylum claims are processed and would need to close the border, he said, if necessary. It all seems in line with this alleged deal between these two nations.
Well, initially it seemed that way, but there's some pushback, it looks like, from the Mexican side, where they're saying that the talks are still in progression. It's not concluded yet, because there's been pressure from their own base, I'm sure, to say, look, don't just roll over and let America dictate to you what you're going to do with migrants who are on their way to the United States, not just to Mexico. So there's still a lot to be worked out here, George, and there's nationalism on both sides, and there's also practical questions about how are these folks resettled in a country that's still having economic problems itself, as Mexico has, especially since NAFTA was passed, and there were a lot of problems with low wages over there and dumping of U.S. corn over there during NAFTA and driving Mexican farmers out of work who went to work in factories. And finally, people have come here undocumented-wise, and now they've got people from Central America fleeing the economic crises there, coming to Mexico and making their way up here. So it's not a settled or done deal yet, George, and a lot of macroeconomic problems have to be addressed.
President Trump has been very clear. He wants migrants to either seek asylum at official ports of entry or prepare to be detained if they try to enter the United States by any other means. How does this square with this ruling by a federal judge earlier in the week, temporarily blocking the government from denying asylum to those crossing the border between ports of entry?
I believe the federal judge was correct because the U.S. law requires that asylum seeker who ends up in the U.S. border, doesn't matter if it's a port of entry designated officially or not, has to be granted an interview or allowed to come in and be interviewed carefully. So it doesn't have to be at the port of entry, and President Trump's trying to regulate it and control it considerably to show his base that he's not easy on migrants. These are folks who've been having a terrible situation in their own country, like Honduras, for example, where there was a military coup a few years ago when President Manuel Zelaya was overthrown, a progressive leftist president who brought in land reform and brought in more help for poor people. And this president was overthrown by a dictatorship, and a new government was elected in an illegitimate election. And so people are fleeing the resultant degradation of the economy and the drug dealing that comes in when the economy goes bankrupt. And those Honduran asylum seekers and also refugees should be given a hearing and given a chance in life once again. Because after all, the United States corporations were involved in Honduras and also in Guatemala, for example, for years. It's not always been a very equitable relationship either at the time.
Well, you know, the chronology is important. So there was the ruling, and then there's this Trump tweet. Does the Trump tweet go against the ruling?
It does, because the ruling says that an asylum seeker who comes to the U.S. border has to be allowed hearing no matter where they land, whether it's a port of entry or not. But Trump is, again, trying to go against the U.S. code and saying they have to come to these ports of entry. In fact, they have to stay in Mexico while their applications are being considered. That's totally egregious in my view. It's not really in compliance with the U.S. code and the U.S. law, and that means we have to act as a rule of law country. We are a rule of law country, and he should abide by the law, and the judge is correct in my view.
Peter Mathews, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, George.
CNN has learned that